Hello there, friend. My name is Walter Hayes. I'm 78 years old and I've been living in this little cabin in the woods for almost 40 years. Most people out there don't know me. And honestly, that's just the way I like it. Out here it's quiet. Just the river, the wind in the trees, and my old dog sitting right beside me. I wasn't always a man of the forest, though. Long before this cabin, long before the river, I was just a young man trying to figure out what life really meant. And the story I'm about to tell you is how I ended up here. Most people spend their whole lives chasing something. Money, success, recognition. I chased something too. Gold. My name is Walter and I've spent the last 40 years living in this cabin in the woods. Every morning I sit here right by this window. I watch the forest wake up. The wind moving through the trees. The river flowing down the hill. And my old dog, Rusty, waiting patiently by the door. He knows exactly where we're going. The river. I wasn't always a prospector. 40 years ago, I lived in a city. Noise everywhere. People rushing. Cars, lights, endless movement. I had a job. A decent one too. But something inside me always felt wrong. Like I was living someone else's life. Then one day, everything changed. A friend of mine invited me on a trip to the mountains. Just a weekend. Fishing, hiking, nothing special. But that weekend I saw something I had never seen before. A man standing knee-deep in a cold mountain river swirling a metal pan in the water. I asked him what he was doing. He looked up at me, smiled, and said, "Looking for gold." At first I thought he was joking. Gold? Like in the old movies? But he showed me the pan. And there it was. Tiny golden flakes shining in the sunlight. Something about that moment stayed with me. The simplicity of it. Just a man, a river, and the chance of finding something hidden beneath the water. No bosses. No meetings. No noise. Just patience. A year later I quit my job. Sold most of what I owned. And bought this land. Back then this cabin wasn't much more than a wooden box. No electricity. No railroad. Just forest and silence. People thought I was crazy. Maybe I was. The first winter was brutal. Snow everywhere. Temperatures dropping below zero. I almost gave up more than once. But every morning I walked down to the river. Pan in hand. Searching. Days passed. Weeks. Months. Most days I found nothing. Just rocks. Sand. Cold water. But once in a while a tiny piece of gold would appear in the pan. And those tiny moments kept me going. Years passed. Seasons changed. Friends from the city slowly stopped calling. The world moved on without me. But out here time feels different. You start noticing things people in the city never see. How the forest changes color with the seasons. How the river rises after rain. How silence can be louder than noise. And then one day about 12 years after I moved here something happened. I was standing in the river just like always. Cold water rushing around my boots. I dipped the pan into the gravel. Swirled it slowly. Let the water wash away the dirt. Then I saw it. Not flakes. Not dust. A nugget. A real one. The biggest piece of gold I had ever seen. For a moment I just stared at it. 40 years of dreams sitting right there in my hand. Most people think that moment must have changed my life. But the truth is it didn't. I sold that nugget months later. Paid for repairs on this cabin. Some tools. And a better roof. But the real treasure wasn't the gold. It was everything that came before it. The mornings by the river. The quiet nights by the fire. The feeling of living at the same pace as the forest. Gold didn't change my life. This place did. These days I don't search as much as I used to. My knees aren't what they used to be. Rusty's getting old too. But every morning we still walk down to the river. Sometimes I bring the pan. Sometimes I just sit on the rocks and listen to the water. People ask me sometimes, was it worth it? 40 years. Out here. Looking for something most people never find. And I always tell them the same thing. I didn't spend 40 years looking for gold. I spent 40 years finding peace. If you ever find yourself chasing something, money, success, or even gold, remember this. Sometimes the thing you're looking for isn't what you find. Sometimes the real treasure is the life you build along the way. When people ask me where my story really began, I always tell them it started long before this cabin, long before the river, long before I ever held a gold pan in my hands. It started with my parents. My father was a quiet man. He worked with his hands most of his life. Carpentry, repairs, small construction jobs, whatever work he could find. He wasn't the kind of man who talked much. But when he did speak, people listened. He used to say something to me when I was a boy. Walter, the world will try to tell you what your life should look like. But if you listen carefully, the forest will tell you something different. Back then, I didn't understand what he meant. To me, the world was simple. A small house, a dusty road, and a family trying to get by. My mother, she was the heart of our home. Kind, patient, always busy doing something. Cooking, sewing, fixing clothes, and making sure we never felt poor even when we had very little. She had this way of smiling that made everything feel all right, even during the hard winters. I remember one winter especially. Snow piled up so high it nearly covered the windows. The roads were blocked for days. Food was getting scarce. But my mother still found a way to turn that winter into something warm. She would light candles in the evening, and my father would sit by the stove telling stories. Stories about mountains, about rivers, about the old gold rush days. Those stories lit a fire inside my imagination. I would sit there on the floor as a boy, listening to every word. Men traveling through forests, sleeping under the stars, searching rivers for gold. Back then it sounded like adventure, like freedom. I didn't know it yet, but those stories were slowly shaping the rest of my life. My grandfather also had a big influence on me. He lived not far from us. A tough old man with rough hands and a long gray beard. He had spent most of his life outdoors, fishing, hunting, fixing things. He was the one who first took me into the woods. I must have been 10 years old. He handed me a small fishing rod and said, "Out here you learn patience." We walked through the forest for hours that day. No noise, no hurry, just trees, wind, and the sound of water somewhere ahead. When we reached the river, I remember thinking it was the most beautiful place I had ever seen. The water was clear, cold, moving slowly between the rocks. My grandfather sat down on a large stone and simply watched the river. For a long time he said nothing. Then finally he spoke. Most people walk past places like this without ever really seeing them. I didn't fully understand what he meant, but I felt something, a kind of peace that was different from anything in town. We spent many days like that over the years, fishing, walking, learning how to read the forest. He taught me how to track animals, how to start a fire, how to listen to the wind before a storm. But most importantly, he taught me to be comfortable with silence. That lesson stayed with me for the rest of my life. As I grew older, things began to change. School ended. Work started. Responsibilities appeared. Like most young men, I thought the city was where life really happened. Bright lights, opportunities, money, adventure. So I left home. I remember the day clearly. My mother hugged me longer than usual. My father just placed his hand on my shoulder and nodded. My grandfather said only one thing. "If the world ever gets too loud, you know where the forest is." At the time I smiled and told him I would be fine. I was young, and like most young men, I thought I understood everything. But life has a way of teaching lessons slowly. Years later, when the city noise started to feel too heavy, when the crowds began to feel empty, I remembered his words. And eventually, those words brought me back to places like this. Places with rivers, trees, and silence. Looking back now, I realized something important. The life I live today didn't begin when I found gold. It began when I was just a boy, sitting on the floor near a warm stove, listening to stories about rivers and mountains. Sometimes the paths we walk as adults are already waiting for us in childhood. We just don't see them yet. After I left home, the world suddenly became much bigger than I had imagined. The small roads, the quiet forests, the slow rivers of my childhood were replaced by something completely different. The city. At first it felt exciting. Tall buildings everywhere. Cars rushing through the streets. People moving quickly with purpose. Lights that never seemed to turn off. It felt like the center of the world. I rented a small apartment not far from where I worked. It wasn't much. Just a narrow room with a small window that looked out onto another building. But at that time it felt like independence. My first real job was in a repair company. We fixed machines, tools, small industrial equipment. Nothing glamorous. But it paid the bills. And when you're young sometimes that's all you think you need. The days started to fall into a routine. Wake up early. Grab a quick breakfast. Take the crowded bus to work. 8 sometimes 10 hours of work. Then the bus again. The city was always loud. Horns from cars. People shouting across the streets. Construction noise echoing between buildings. At first I barely noticed it. But after a few years something started to feel different. The excitement slowly faded. And in its place came something else. A strange feeling that I couldn't explain at the time. Every day felt the same. Wake up. Work. Sleep. Then repeat it all again the next morning. The city never slowed down. But somehow my life started to feel like it was standing still. Sometimes after work I would walk through the streets just to clear my head. The sidewalks were always crowded. People walking quickly, always looking forward, rarely looking at each other. Everyone seemed to be chasing something. Money, success, a better job, a bigger apartment. But very few people seemed happy once they caught it. One evening I remember standing at a crosswalk waiting for the light to change. Cars rushing past. People standing around me. And suddenly I realized something. Even though I was surrounded by hundreds of people, I had never felt more alone. That moment stayed with me for a long time. I tried to ignore it at first. I told myself this was just how life worked. Work hard. Earn money. Build a future. But something deep inside me kept whispering that there had to be something more. On weekends I tried to escape the city whenever I could. Sometimes I drove out to the countryside. Sometimes I visited small lakes outside town. And every time I left the city behind, I felt something inside me relax. The noise disappeared. The air felt different. And for the first time all week I could actually hear my own thoughts again. One Sunday afternoon I found myself sitting near a quiet river, watching the water move slowly between the rocks. It reminded me of the rivers my grandfather used to take me to when I was a boy. I stayed there for hours, just sitting, thinking. And that was the first moment I began to question the life I was living. Years passed like that. Work, routine, noise. The city never changed. But inside me something was slowly shifting. I began to realize that the things I once thought were important didn't really matter that much anymore. Bigger paychecks, better offices, promotions. None of it gave me the feeling I had when I was standing in the forest as a child. One night, after a long day at work, I returned to my apartment. The window was open, and I could hear the city outside. Sirens in the distance. Engines. Voices echoing between buildings. I sat down in the chair beside the window and stared out at the lights. Hundreds of windows glowing across the city skyline. Thousands of people living their lives behind them. And suddenly a memory came back to me. My grandfather's voice. If the world ever gets too loud, you know where the forest is. For the first time in many years, I started thinking about those words seriously. Maybe the life I had chosen wasn't the only path after all. Maybe somewhere beyond the city, beyond the noise, beyond the endless rush of people chasing things, there was another way to live. I didn't know it yet, but that thought, that small quiet thought, was the beginning of everything that would come next. Because not long after that, I took a trip into the mountains. Just a short weekend trip. A break from the city. A chance to breathe fresh air again. I had no idea that trip would change the rest of my life forever. But sometimes the biggest turns in life begin with the smallest decisions. And that simple trip would eventually lead me to a river, a gold pan, and the quiet cabin where I now sit telling you this story. Anyway, the fire's getting low tonight, but next time I'll tell you the story about the man I met in the mountains, the man who showed me how to find gold. And trust me, that's a story worth hearing.